All right, great. All right, welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefebvre, the Xojo developer evangelist, and I'm very pleased this time to have a couple special guests in our Xojo Q&A for FileMaker developers webinar. I have Tim Dietrich and Hal Gumbert, longtime FileMaker developers. I am Paul Lefebvre, as I said, and you're not going to get to listen to me too much because I don't really know a whole lot about FileMaker, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview here. We're going to start the ball rolling. I have a few startup questions for Tim and Hal to get the ball rolling. And then I invite everyone out there to type your questions into the Q&A window. You can access that. It should be on the toolbar on your viewer window for this webinar. You can just tap that and you can type your questions right in there and we'll get through them. I don't see why we won't have any trouble getting through all the questions. We've got plenty of time. So let's get started. So why Xojo? Well, we've been hearing from some people that sometimes they want to make apps that supplement FileMaker. And that is an important thing that we're here to talk about, is that Xojo isn't necessarily a replacement for FileMaker. It's something that can supplement FileMaker to help you make apps that you might not otherwise been able to create using FileMaker. So Xojo is a full-featured app development tool. It can create desktop apps for OS X, for Windows, and for Linux. It can create web apps, and it can create iOS apps. Xojo has a wide variety of database support. It can connect to all the databases you see here: SQLite, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server. You can use ODBC to connect to just about any database for which you have an ODBC driver for. And you can also use Xojo's built-in networking capabilities to connect to web services, which allow you to connect to just about anything else that acts as a data store that maybe has a web service in front of it instead of directly connecting to the database. There is a demo online of a web app that is using a SQLite database. It's kind of a customer order system. We call it Eddie's Electronics. And you can view that at demos.xojo.com if you want to see what a web app made with Xojo that uses SQLite looks like. Xojo itself includes over 350 example projects that cover a lot of different things. Obviously desktop, web, iOS projects, various specific features within those categories. So lots of things in there to review. And there's also, to learn more about Xojo, you can go to the Xojo Dev Center. That's where all the documentation is hosted. And you can find getting started documents, reference guides, and a whole lot more. I'm going to briefly just cover Xojo's pricing so you guys have an understanding of that. Xojo has multiple price points, anywhere from $99 up to $1,999. Xojo Pro is the most useful and best value package. That's the one that includes pretty much everything. So with Xojo Pro, you can build apps for any of the things Xojo supports. When you purchase Xojo, you get quarterly updates for 1 year. And that gives you a 1-year license essentially. And you can continue using Xojo after your license expires. So you don't have to, it's not like Xojo dies once your license expires or anything like that. You can continue to keep using it. And you can renew at any time. There's no penalty for waiting to renew. You can renew early, you can renew later. It doesn't really matter. Xojo is licensed per developer. So if you have multiple people on your team, they would each need Xojo licenses. So it's licensed per developer. But users themselves do not need licenses to run any software that you create using Xojo. You only need the license for the developer, and then anything you create with Xojo can be freely distributed and used by your users or your customers. All right, so a little background on our two FileMaker fellows who are going to be taking questions. We have Tim Dietrich, and his website is at timdietrich.me. And email there, you can reach him at. Tim is a longtime FileMaker developer, among other things. And we also have Hal Gumbert of Camp Software and his website and email address. So to get started, I think you guys Hal and Tim can probably unmute yourselves, and I can run through these initial questions we have here, and then we can let people open up or type in their own questions, and we can get to those. Welcome, Tim, and welcome, Hal.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Paul.
All right, so the first question we have here and kind of our pre-question list is, how did you guys get started with both FileMaker and Xojo?
Hal, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I started with FileMaker when I started college. I went to Drexel University, and we were required to buy a Mac, and our bundle came with FileMaker. And didn't use it too much throughout college, but then my first job out of college was with a destination management company, and we used FileMaker to put people on buses and get them from hotels to attractions. And the software we created minimized the number of buses that they needed and kept the amount of time that people had to wait to a minimum as well. And ever since, we've been creating solutions with FileMaker. And on the Xojo side, I don't know if I started with the first version, but it was around 1998. That's when I found my first license when I purchased it. It was around that day or year. And we've created over the years many apps for mostly for the Mac, some Windows. We had a thing called Info Pop-Up. It was kind of like a really, really early version of Text Expander. And we had many utilities. But our biggest product, we had a product called Keystroke Recorder, which was an app that allowed people to record what was typed on their computer. It was to kind of watch your kids, what they're up to and all that. And that was our biggest moneymaker. And then corporate-wise, I worked for a company called Mac Academy, and we created their CD-ROM interface using Xojo. In fact, Jeff Coffey's and Jerry Robbins' CDs for FileMaker, which a lot of FileMaker people have watched, was actually run by the Xojo software in the background. So that's pretty much how I got started.
This is Tim. Yeah, I started using FileMaker a long, long time ago. I was working actually for my family's business and had developed a DOS. I guess this kind of shows how long ago this was. It was a DOS-based system to run their business, built with a programming language called Clarion. And anyway, I had bought a Mac for use at home and kind of fell in love with the Mac platform. And my intention with the Mac at home was just to kind of use it to write and do personal things. But I ended up liking the Mac platform so much that I decided to kind of look around and see how I might build solutions for our business, and found FileMaker. And I've been, using it really ever since. More recently, I guess, to develop custom databases for clients. And then late last year, I kind of became interested in developing native mobile apps. And so I started looking for a platform that I could use to do that and, to learn pretty quickly. I had looked at a whole bunch of things like LiveCode and Swift and even PhoneGap for developing hybrid apps. And of course, Xojo. And out of all of those, the one that sort of clicked with me was Xojo. And so, now while I'm not really actively doing a lot of FileMaker work, I do have a number of my older clients who are heavily invested in the FileMaker platform. And so one of the things I've been doing is using Xojo to build native apps that use those FileMaker databases on the back end. And that's been both a huge success, and the clients love it. And I've been just having a lot of fun doing it. So that's my story.
All right, great. Thanks, guys. All right, the second question I have here is, what's it like developing apps with Xojo compared to developing FileMaker solutions?
I guess I'll start off. So I was kind of thinking about this, and it's kind of like in Spider-Man when Uncle Ben said to Peter Parker, "With great power comes great responsibility." And Xojo gives you a lot more power, but it also has that responsibility too. Most of the way I've kind of learned to like working in Xojo with FileMaker, it's very similar. If you built a FileMaker solution where your layout only contained global fields. So you would start off by populating that data with your record. So you do a find, take your record data, set it to the global fields, let the user do what they're supposed to do. And if they made any changes, you'd take those changes and save them back to the record. So Xojo Windows or Xojo Pages, depending if it's a desktop or web app, you basically have these fields on those pages or windows that don't really know too much about anything else. So I'll get more into like how I'm dealing with that later, but that's probably the big difference, is just getting past that, because FileMaker makes it really easy since all of our layouts are bound to a record. Also, it's like starting with FileMaker. The very first time you touch FileMaker, you could do some stuff, but maybe doing a particular thing was difficult because you didn't have that experience. But as you start using FileMaker more and more and more, you learn these methods to get things done. So that's pretty much the same with Xojo. Let's see. Other than that, they have a lot of parallels. The way you code custom functions by creating formulas and let statements is somewhat similar to Xojo. And let's see, one last thing. Basically, if you don't rush it and take your time, it makes it a whole lot easier. Ask for a lot of help. The Xojo forums are really good. They're at forums.xojo.com. I think Paul's going to have a link for that later. And also, Tim and I have a Slack channel for FileMaker called FM Peeps. And within that Slack, we have a specific channel for Xojo. So if you have any questions, pop in and let us know.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Hal said. I think, though, it's developing between Xojo and FileMaker, I think it's very different. With Xojo, you kind of start with a blank slate, and that can be a little bit intimidating at first, I think, especially when you're getting started with Xojo, because it's entirely up to you what you do with that blank slate. I guess it's like using Hal's analogy. It's kind of like creating a new layout in FileMaker and there's nothing on it. But even more so when you start sort of dragging fields and objects onto the layout, it's up to you to wire those things up, and that includes the fields. It takes some time to kind of get up to speed with it. But what's really cool is that once you do get up to speed with Xojo and you start to get a handle on how everything fits and works together, you begin to realize that you can pretty much do anything that you want to do or that you need to do. So at that point, it's only your limitation or the only real limitation that you have, I think, is just your imagination. You can pretty much build anything with it. And that's, certainly something that appeals to me.
All right, great. And hang on here. I think I lost my screen. All right, there we go. We're back. All right, so next question here is, were you or how were you able to use your FileMaker knowledge to make learning Xojo easier?
In my case,
say Hal should probably
what I learned. Oh, sorry about that, Paul.
That's right.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, that's all right. Go ahead.
Okay. So when I was in college, my Drexel was a college that had a co-op program. So every 6 months, we would go work for 6 months. And I worked for an insurance company and did a lot of COBOL programming. And my boss taught me something that it's still in my head. He's like, all this programming is easy. You're adding things, you're changing things, and you're deleting things. And to this day, I still think that way. Like I'm adding records, I'm changing records, and I'm deleting records. And that's really all there is to it. So I used that knowledge to get started in FileMaker. And everything I learned in FileMaker and my COBOL experience also still applies in Xojo. I mean, it's just another programming language. It's not too difficult in the beginning to convert custom functions and value lists to Xojo. There's specific things you need to do And we can chat another time about like how you would do those, but they're really not that difficult. It's just a different way of doing things. And scripts in FileMaker are very similar to Xojo methods. It's less point and click and more typing of commands. But in Xojo, there's autocomplete, like FileMaker 14 added. And if you use execute SQL in FileMaker, you'll use that a lot in Xojo. In fact, that's pretty much how you access your databases, assuming you're using a SQL type of database.
Yeah, I think for me, no, I didn't really, while I think at the high level, the concepts between FileMaker and Xojo are very similar depending on the type of app you're making. I think when it kind of gets down to the actual, the programming itself, I didn't really find that my FileMaker knowledge helped much. I think I actually pulled more from my experience with other languages like, PHP and even Clarion way back in the day. And certainly, tapping into some of the experience I had with SQL has helped a lot. But I think what made the language different for me was that it was really the first time I really dug deep into an object-oriented programming language. And that can be a little bit intimidating, I think, at first. But I think Xojo and the way that the Xojo IDE work, they really make that easy to some degree. So, yeah, I guess, to kind of sum it up, I really don't think that my FileMaker knowledge helped a lot in learning Xojo, but it certainly did make me think about, what it is I'm trying to accomplish when I'm developing a Xojo app, and then try to figure out, okay, well, how do I do that in Xojo? So I know what the end result is that I'm trying to get to, but I'm just going about it in a different way.
All right, great.
I think your comment, Tim, about PHP, the PHP comment that Tim made, I think applies a lot, because if you have ever done any PHP work, you have essentially an HTML form with fields, and those fields don't know anything. You have to populate them, get the values, and do stuff with them. So I think that was really smart, Tim.
Right, yeah, Xojo being a full-featured programming language does require stuff like that. All right, so next thing I have on here is, what are the favorite things you like about Xojo? Start with Hal.
Well, the one thing I love about it is that it's object-oriented, and there is still stuff in Xojo that I don't comprehend yet, but that doesn't stop me from doing what I need to do. I'm learning new things all the time. Recently, I've been working on this method of making Xojo work with databases and fields a lot like FileMaker, which I'll talk about later. It uses this feature called introspection, which is mind-blowing once you start learning about it. And it's basically, you can take something like a page or layout and get a list of all the controls on it, like fields and buttons and all this stuff, and do stuff to them, which is really amazing. And Xojo has another control with, like something you would put onto a layout called a container, which is different than a FileMaker container. These containers are essentially subforms in a way. So you could create a container with fields and such on it, and then drag that container onto your layout, and then all those fields that are in the container end up being on your layout. And that creates something that you can reuse. So if you have something that you want to put on many layouts or all your layouts, you could just make a container and reuse it. You don't have to keep recreating it on every layout. And the real power comes in that if you want to change something or add something, you do it in one place. And every single place in your application updates it. It's really amazing. I also like the forums, like I mentioned earlier. The community's amazing. I posted dumb questions, and people come back with great answers and don't give you any flack about it, which is quite nice. I find it easy to share code. Little easy, actually, I'm going to just say it, much easier than FileMaker. If you want to create a module in FileMaker, you have layouts and value lists and custom functions and tables and fields, and all that stuff has to be created in the right order, or it'll break, or you'll have to go fix it. And with Xojo, you can literally create modules. Like, and a module might have a page or a window, fields, a database connection. I mean, it's really really modular. It's really amazing. The developer conference, Xojo's developers conference, is called XDC for Xojo Developer Conference. That's amazing. I learn stuff every time I go. And I think that's all I have.
Yeah, you've got some good stuff on that list, Hal. I'll try not to repeat, but yeah, I think, for me, I love how logical the just the process of developing with Xojo is, and how easy the Xojo IDE makes it. So, for me, it seems like it's just, when I look at the Xojo IDE, it seems like a really intuitive and sort of elegant tool. And if you guys have ever used Xcode or even just opened it up, it's like night and day compared to Xcode. It's just much friendlier to me. And I think the language too, Hal pointed out, the ability to share code and make code modular is huge. Once you actually start getting some code and you start to build your own library, or finding libraries that other developers have shared, that can do a couple of things. One, it can certainly make development much faster. But I think it also is a way to learn, because as you're looking at what other people have shared, you start to see techniques, and you look at something and think, well, I wonder what that does. And so it's a great way to get up to speed, both with the language, and then also I think just, again, it helps with rapid development. But I think of all of the features of Xojo, I think what my favorite one really is just the ability to create real native apps. And for so many platforms too. And that's just a huge deal for me. It's been a game changer, because now I can go to clients and pretty much build whatever they need. My focus is mostly on mobile, but there would be no stopping me if I really wanted to take what I know as far as Xojo goes and easily build desktop apps or web apps. So I think that's awesome. And then, going back to one of your slides, Paul, the Xojo's pricing, I've kind of called it developer friendly. And I think that's a really good way to describe it, because you really only need to get the licenses for the platforms that you're compiling for. And you do that annually, and then you just forget about it. You don't have to worry about end user licenses or server licenses, and that's huge. It allows us to create much more affordable solutions, especially over the long run. How you pointed out the community, and that has been so powerful for me, especially the forums. Pretty much any question you can think of when you're starting to dig into Xojo, if you go to the forums, somebody's already asked it, and there's, fantastic answers, and, people will share code, so you can't beat that. And I think the last thing I would say is that I also really have come to appreciate Xojo as a company. It's just interesting the way that they go about doing what they do. There's the multiple releases throughout the year. They seem to respond and listen to the users, and it's pretty clear what they're trying to do. What their goal is for the Xojo, the development platform. There's nothing ambiguous about it. They're trying to create a really great multi-platform development tool, and I think they're doing a great job of doing it.
All right, great. Thanks, guys. Let's see. Almost at our end of our list here. And I think you might have touched on this a little bit already, but what sort of things do you like to use Xojo to do for you? Start with Hal.
For me, sorry. For me, it's really about building. I should say, up until about 2 years ago, it was about building apps that weren't really database driven. But now it's more, I'm focusing really all my time on database-driven apps. Like I said earlier, we created apps that did weird things, like our keystroke recorder. And there was actually, I noticed a question from Daniel that says, can you give an example of something you created in Xojo that would be difficult or impossible in FileMaker? And that my keystroke recorder product was one of those things. It had to sit there and listen to the computer, like all the every key you typed in the background. So like that was something you couldn't do. And we had another product for a client that they basically they printed letters. They would send those letters to their clients. The clients would write things on them with their pen or pencil and mail them back. And we included some text on it, and we basically OCR'd the document to try to find the document ID so that we could automatically scan and file that document and basically put it away. So you might be able to do that in FileMaker now using the MBS plugin from MonkeyBread, but we did that before that was available because we used literally the MonkeyBread plugin for Xojo, and that I'll talk a little more about that later. Another thing that you can't, or you won't be able to do, you may or may not be able to do in the future, are create FileMaker runtimes. Right, FileMaker still supports runtimes, and they're in 14, and they publicly said that they're going to support them in FileMaker 15, but they are on the list to be deprecated. And with Xojo, I really basically got started creating database-driven apps for our art licensing manager product that we sell that's currently a runtime. And I kind of got diverted with that with another project that is basically a database-driven solution, pretty much the same as our art licensing manager for an entirely different company type. So eventually you might not be able to do runtimes in FileMaker. And the other thing you cannot do in FileMaker that you can do in Xojo that I know of is create iOS apps. And we created our reference for FileMaker. If you go to the iOS App Store and search for reference for FileMaker, we created an iOS app that we could search for functions, script steps, and a few other things that we couldn't get. We couldn't get our FileMaker Go solution on the App Store, but we could do that with Xojo.
So this is Tim. I've mostly been using Xojo to develop iOS apps, and especially in cases where the project has a short fuse, because I mentioned earlier that Xojo sort of excels at rapid application development. So in those cases, I think it's a great fit. And then to just kind of reiterate what Hal said, we're talking about developing real native apps that can go on the App Store. There's nothing involved and nothing else involved with them. So you actually develop the app, you compile it, it's the real deal. And that would be true whether it was an iOS app or a desktop app. It is a real executable app, very similar to the runtime solutions that you might be used to in FileMaker. But as you guys probably know, you can't really do that with iOS apps on the FileMaker platform. So to me, that is huge, just the ability to create real native apps. And that's really what I'm doing with it primarily.
All right, great. And the last question we have before we will go through all the questions that our listeners have been asking, and we'll get through all of everyone's questions. So if you have questions, you can type them in the window as you think of it. You don't have to wait till we open up the floor for questions, so to speak. So the last question we have on here is, what sort of things do you like to use with Xojo to make development with it a little easier? Start with Hal.
So for what I've experienced is the number one thing are the forums, and I've mentioned it twice, maybe 3 times before, is that the forums are amazing. So if I get stuck, I try to find the answer by Googling and searching the forums, and if I can't find it, I ask. There's a really great set of a tool called Dash. It's a Mac app. I don't know if there's a Windows version, but some of the Xojo documentation is available there. And also there's documentation for the MBS plugin. Christian with MonkeyBread, he keeps his documents up to date. I'm not sure if Xojo has official documents, but somebody in the community, I think, created it from Paul's excellent documentation. And since I mentioned the MonkeyBread plugin documentation, the MonkeyBread plugin is literally amazing. It's a lifesaver. I couldn't do many of the things I do without the MBS plugin. But that said, you could do a lot with Xojo by itself, but MonkeyBread really extends Xojo's language so that you can access different bits in the operating system, like the address book, the OCR. There's literally crazy amounts. If you guys happen to use the FileMaker MBS plugin, you guys are only seeing a fraction of what Christian's plugin can do, because the Xojo version is just insane with what it can do. And I'm sure if you needed something in FileMaker, you could ask him and he would port it over to the FileMaker plugin. One thing that I've started to create, I don't know how many months ago, but in this quest to create a replacement for our art licensing manager runtime in FileMaker, is I've created this thing called Easy Data. And the concept is I want to create this thing, this class is what it's called in Xojo, that lets my fields be smart. So as I said earlier, and Tim mentioned it, that the fields are just there. They're like a vessel to hold information, but they don't by default have a lot of smarts. So Easy Data is there to try to help you with all that. So you can lay your fields on your window or page, and then you tell, like when you open the window, you tell those fields, you tell Easy Data that these fields exist. And it's literally minimal code, like maybe 3-4 lines of code. And it runs through using introspection, which I talked about earlier, and finds all the fields, sets all the fields. There's a function to save. It'll commit all the data. Internally, Easy Data is really crazy complex, but as I'm using it more and more, it's saving me an incredible amount of time and making Xojo a lot easier to use. Paul will have a URL for that later if he hasn't shown it. Yeah, Easy Data is really easy, as it sounds. You take the class and you just drag it into your window, and you create a property, which is like a variable. Xojo has a lot of neat stuff you can't do in FileMaker, like having a variable on your layout that you can use. I know you can put dollar sign variables or $ variables, but these are like literally for that window only. And then when your window opens, you call like a line of code to initialize it. You tell the Easy Data class, which is basically your interface to the database, you tell it your database, the name of the table. So if you're working with customers, you tell it, oh, it's customers. You tell it the name of your key. So if it's ID or UUID, and a few other things. I can go on and on and on about this, but you tell it about your database, and then you just let it go. And now, if I have to add a new field to my database, I go into the SQL and add a new column, and then I go to my layout and drag a new field onto it, and I just name it. I use names, the name of the field, to control everything. I just name it properly, and it works. I don't have to do any extra coding for a simple. And then there's several, I'll just run through these real fast. Monkeybird also has a thing called the Web Starter Kit. It's a really great framework to kind of understand a lot of things you need to learn when you create a web app, like hashing passwords and all that kind of good stuff. There's some controls from a website for jeremyleroy.com. I didn't give any of these to Paul, unfortunately, but we could get that to you later. And then there's another one called webcustomcontrols.com from Taylor Design. These people, they're creating objects. Like Xojo has a lot of objects to begin with, like fields and timers and all these. But these people, Jeremy and Taylor Design, the objects that you can just add. Like I needed a drop-down date field, and Jeremy Leroy had one that was beautiful, and I just plopped it in, and it was great. And then I think that's it. Yeah, one last thing would be for iOS. When you develop with iOS, it requires you to use declares if you want to use special features like accessing the camera. Like if you want to take a picture and store that into the database, you have to use a declare. But there's 4 or 5 people, Jason King, Michelle Ulrich, Christian Smith with MBS, and Jean-Paul. They all have these great libraries that basically take the really complex. Tim's figured it out. He's really good at declares now, but if you don't know declares, like I don't know declares. So I use their libraries, and they give me a simple call which would be just like calling a FileMaker script, and then I can take a picture. So that's just amazing. So I think that's all I have for that.
Yeah, so I think you stole a lot of my thunder, Hal. I guess
Sorry.
that's okay. No, no, I think you hit on a lot of it. The code reuse is huge for me. I mentioned that earlier, and by that I mean not only the code I've written myself and kind of built up my own little library, but also code that people have shared. The declares are huge. That really opens up a world of possibilities on the mobile apps, as far as developing mobile apps goes, anyway. And then for me, I've also been I released a solution a few months back called Easy API that I used to build APIs for FileMaker. That's actually on my site. It's been there for a couple months, and it's been pretty popular. I use that so that my iOS apps can go through the API and hit the database. So it's something to keep in mind when you're developing mobile apps, and regardless whether you're building them with Xojo or what have you, that most mobile apps don't hit a database directly, at least not a hosted database. So they're going to go through an API. And so I've been using this Easy API to build those APIs, and that's really helped me quite a bit as far as developing mobile apps goes. I'm actually hoping to release a new version of that pretty soon that just does a lot more than what the original version of Easy API did. So, for me, with my focus on mobile apps, that middle layer there, the API layer, is huge. So the faster I can crank that out, the better. So I think that's kind of my secret weapon right now.
All right, thanks, guys. As you can tell, there's a lot of add-ons and enhancements you can add to Xojo to make it do even more than it can already do right out of the box. I switched the slide here to the FileMaker resources slide, which is just a smattering of some FileMaker specific things that you might find useful. Couple to highlight: the Dev Center at the top is probably you might want to spend a little time digging around there. You can start with the migrating from FileMaker page, which has some general overviews, and it also has a link to the Xojo.fm open source library that has a bunch of the FileMaker functions that you might all be familiar with implemented, so you can kind of use them directly in Xojo. Tim earlier this year did a webinar on how to use a FileMaker database with a Xojo iOS app, so you might find that interesting. That's available. A couple of the links that Tim and Hal mentioned regarding their easy data access items are available. The XDC conference links are up now, and then they also mentioned the FileMaker Peeps thing. I forgot to put a link on here, Hal, of the forum, surprisingly. It's actually forum singular.xojo. So I can bring that up later if we get a chance. But now we've got time to go through the questions here. So I'm going to scroll up to the top, and we'll get through all of these. So we'll just start at the top and work our way down and answer what we can. So we got the first question here is from an anonymous person. I didn't know Zoom let you do that. And it says, feels that Xojo is mostly focused on iOS and Mac. Are there any disadvantages being a Windows developer other than not being able to run the iOS simulator while making an iOS app? Would I be better off running Xojo on a Macintosh? Well, I'm going to presume that most FileMaker people are actually using a Mac at this point. Like I said, I'm not really a FileMaker guy, but I would presume that it's a Mac app primarily.
No, Paul, I don't think so. I mean, it really is kind of both.
Is it? All right. Well, Xojo is also both. And like the commenter here noted, the big disadvantage of running Xojo on Windows is that you can't create iOS apps on Windows. That Apple's tools that are needed, the libraries and the simulator, are not available on Windows. You won't be able to create iOS apps on Windows. But other than that, you can do everything else on Windows. You do find a fairly large number of people do use Macs, but looking at our numbers, I do think we have about 50-50. For 50% people use Windows, 50% people use Macs, and a tiny percentage are using Linux. But the big advantage of running on Mac is that a Mac can easily run all the major operating systems. So, I mean, obviously it has OS X because it's Mac, but you can also run Windows and Linux in virtual machines. So it makes it easy to have a single computer that can run all three operating systems. Whereas if you're running on Windows, it's a little trickier. If you need to do Mac support or Mac testing, you need to have a Mac separate. You can't really run that in a VM. So it works fine on either, but a lot of people prefer a Mac if they're actually doing fully cross-platform stuff. So I think I might have been able to answer that one. Any other comments from Hal or Tim?
No, I guess
that was great.
Yeah, I guess you kind of nailed it. The question kind of answers it too, which is that yeah, it's tough to develop iOS apps on on a Windows machine anyway, and that's going to be the case regardless of whether you use Xojo or what have you, just simply because you don't have access to the simulator. So
right. All right, next question we have here is from Danny, and he's asking how to scale Xojo web and mobile apps. He's dealing with about 20,000 users, and what's the performance like? Well, I don't think a Xojo web app is going to handle 20,000 users natively out of the box without some sort of load balancing in the front to spread the apps across multiple server instances. But it all depends on what you're doing. I mean, if those are doing a lot of database reading and writing, that could be more, it would need more load balancing. If it's just a lot of read-only stuff, maybe less load balancing would be needed. I don't know. That's probably the sort of thing to ask in the forum to see what sort of things people have built and how they've scaled up to that many users to get actual, real-world practical experience from that sort of thing.
Yeah, Tim and I have actually started to do some thinking about that. We have a client right now that has 16,000 people, and they're planning to expand like exponentially. And what we've been discussing so far is, and we haven't done any of this work yet, it's basically been thinking about it and from some of the comments in the forums, but just as Paul said, they would basically come to like an entry point, which would be a load balancer. And then what you would do is you would take your web app, if you were doing a web app, and basically you'd spin up many, many, many copies of those. So you'd have to figure out how many users one particular web app can handle. I've been trying to find that answer out from people, and the answer is it depends on your solution. So I don't have a clear answer on that because it really does depend on your solution. But if you needed more apps, you just spin up more apps. And I think Tim could talk a little bit about something cool from Amazon and also API stuff as far as accessing data.
Yeah, so I guess to answer it on the mobile side, I mentioned earlier that when you develop a mobile app, you don't typically write directly to the database. You go through an API, so that does give you some advantage there as well as far as being able to scale. And I've recently started to work with Amazon's Aurora, which is their sort of cloud-based version of MySQL, which is, if you haven't looked at that yet, you really should. It's pretty amazing. But as far as its ability to scale on the back end, it's wild. And you could use that both with the web app or with a mobile app. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough question to answer, and I think it's the same. It would be a tough question to answer whether you were talking about Xojo or a PHP app or what have you, because it just depends on what those 20,000 users are doing. So that's a tough one.
But I think the answer is you can do it, but it requires a little bit of work and figuring it out.
All right, moving on to our next question from Michael here. It says, do you need to know C++, Objective-C, or some other scripting or development language to program in Xojo? Well, to program in Xojo, you do need to know how to program. So I will say yes to that. You certainly don't need to know C++ or Objective-C or any of those C-based languages specifically. Xojo probably has more in common from a programming standpoint with something like Visual Basic or Java. Maybe even C#, which has nothing to do with C++ or Objective-C. So it's more along those lines, and maybe it's more similar to something like Python if you're familiar with that. Even if you have, like Tim has mentioned, if you have PHP experience, that's pretty applicable to Xojo. But yeah, having some programming experience is obviously useful. Guys, any thoughts?
No,
I would say.
Go ahead, Hal. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Tim. I was going to say It's different from FileMaker, but it has a lot of parallels. Like I said earlier, in FileMaker we have scripts, and if you want to call a script, you run perform script. And in Xojo, you create methods, and a method is basic. A method kind of looks and feel like a custom function, but really all it is a script. And you have the name of the script, which would be the name of the method, and you have parameters. The difference between FileMaker and Xojo is that FileMaker has one parameter that you have to break your data up yourself in some way, whereas with Xojo, you actually create parameters specifically, and you create them based upon their data type. So you might say, I want to pass in a string, or you could pass anything in. You could literally pass in a window. You can pass in a database. You can pass in like an OCR or a PDF. Like it's really amazing. Anything, you can pass anything, as far as I know. And then doing calculations are pretty similar. Plus and minus and all that. In FileMaker, you would do set variable with the name of the variable, and if you wanted to increment it, you'd put the name of the variable plus 1. In Xojo, you'd have a line of code that says like j equals j plus 1. I would never do j. I would say my index or something like that. But there's a lot of parallels, but there's definitely a lot of different things to learn, like learning to work with object-oriented languages. I went for years and years and years not using object-oriented code at all, and I just started to embrace it about a year or two ago, and my world's changed. It just blows your mind.
All right, so that was this one. I'm just marking these as answered so that we can keep up with the ever-growing list. All right, I have a question here from Ward. Is Xojo a better replacement for runtime? Did you run into rejections when submitting to the App Store? Well, I don't know that I can actually answer that, but I'm going to hand this over to Tim because he just got an app approved in the App Store and might be able to talk about that.
As far as runtimes go, it kind of sounds like you're talking about a native desktop app. And I think you actually have one of those in there, don't you? Or maybe not, I don't know.
So right now I have the reference for FileMaker in the iOS App Store.
Right.
And that's using a local database, and I think that may actually answer another question down the line, but it's using a local database. Like it's not hitting any server. The entire SQL database file is inside the app, and it's using SQLite, which is a really easy to use format of SQL that is built into Xojo. So that's not, I guess it could be called a runtime because it's like a standalone application accessing a database. So I guess I could call that a runtime, but there's really no data entry. It's a reference tool. But what we're working on now is our web apps. And the web app is, I don't think it's possible to submit a web app to the Mac App Store at all. Oh, and I should answer, did we run into rejections? We were rejected twice. One, because we named our product FM reference, and Apple didn't like that. I don't know why, but I'm guessing it might have been because of FM radio being confused with FM for FileMaker. So we renamed it to reference for FileMaker. And we were rejected a second time because I didn't understand the process of adding a file to my project and code signing it. But it turned out to be ridiculously easy to fix. Anytime you add a file, there's an area in Xojo where there's a build step where you can add files to your project. And I was code signing the app before I added the file, which was looked at. After I learned what I did, it was really silly. So I switched the steps so that I added the file and then code signed it, and then it went through. I haven't created any Mac or Windows or Linux applications that would be something that I would call runtime. I don't have any on the App Store, but it would pretty much be the same process. as the reference for FileMaker on the iOS. You really shouldn't run into any rejections unless you're using third-party libraries that aren't code signed, and Paul may be able to talk about that or what that may be caused from. But and I don't know if you could say would Xojo be a better replacement for a runtime, but it's an option. The thing I really like about Xojo for runtimes is how Xojo can build web apps, because the web app to me feels more like a FileMaker solution. Like anybody can use like a browser to access the solution. So I guess it'd be kind of more like WebDirect, but it doesn't feel like WebDirect. It feels like a real app running in a window. I had one more point that I can't recall. Oh, also the other nice part about making web apps is that they're self-contained. You don't have a worry about, like when you build a FileMaker runtime, you bind your FileMaker file to the FileMaker runtime as part of the process of making it with a key. But that somebody could take your FileMaker runtime, pull the database file out, and use it with a copy of FileMaker Pro. And you could add code to prevent them from using other versions and all that good stuff, but that's just not possible with Xojo. Like they have to use it as you intended to build it. And so that kind of could lead to less tech support problems with people not using the right version with the database file, and making sure they have the compatible extensions. Like now in FileMaker, we have 64-bit, so we have to make sure we use the right extension types. But with Xojo, they would be embedded into your app. And again, as a web app, you're running that web app on a server. So the user, it's really hard for the users to screw up or screw you up by trying to run it with something that doesn't make sense unless they use an unsupported browser. So I think I probably said more than I needed, but it's I really like it.
All right. Well, and just to kind of summarize, Xojo desktop apps can absolutely be submitted to the Mac App Store. We got, I don't know, hundreds of people that have done that. There's actually a third-party product called App Wrapper that will go through the process of actually doing all the Apple-specific stuff that's required, so you can easily submit that using iTunes Connect. And as far as what rejections you might run into, you're only going to run into rejections if you run a file of Apple's really long list of rules, like Hal did. But otherwise, Xojo apps work fine. All right, moving ahead here, Joe is asking about an overview of WebDirect versus Xojo web app.
Oh,
I think, Hal, you might have been already...
Paul, I think that was an extension. Yeah, I think that was part... I think his question ran over to that. Like, is it... Ours is better?
Oh, yeah, I noticed you were talking about that.
I don't know.
All right, so
my answer to that is basically WebDirect. I think that works pretty nice. I've heard some people having issues with it, and with printing and a couple other issues. So Xojo web apps, people can just print the web page, so that's like one thing. But if you want to create documents for people to download and print, you have to do that separately. There's a couple great solutions for that. There's a company called Bikini, and they have a product called Shorts. So it's a Bikini Shorts. It's Bkeeny, I believe. And they have a product to create reports. And I think in January, they're going to be creating, or another person in the community actually is creating a solution for a point-and-click report editor, which is really, really, really close to the way FileMaker works. And also the Monkey Bread plugin has an add-on called Dyna PDF, DYNA PDF. And we're looking at Dyna PDF to create reports. And we're in the middle of that.
All right. Ward here is asking, how do you communicate between FMS, FileMaker server maybe, and Xojo? Do you use XML, PHP, or something else? Tim, that sounds like maybe what your webinar was about.
Yeah, so you've got a bunch of options there. It depends on which one you want to take. I've created apps that use the FileMaker API for PHP, And so you have Xojo send an HTTP request to a little web app, and the web app turns around and sends a request to FileMaker. So it's kind of acting as an API in that regard. And so it can use, again, either the FileMaker API if you want, or you could just go do the same kind of thing, but just make XML calls to FileMaker server and completely eliminate the need for FileMaker's API altogether. That's what Easy API does. It does not require FileMaker's API for PHP. It's just making XML calls straight to FileMaker server. The real benefit to that is if you develop an app in something like Xojo and then you have it hit FileMaker on the back end in the short term, then later on, if you decide to swap out the back end for something else, it's just a matter of sort of retooling your API and having it point to that other database. So it could be MySQL or SQL Server or what have you. As far as what the data looks like going back and forth, that's also entirely up to you. I'm using JSON, but you could have it just both send and receive XML if you wanted. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, you kind of start with a blank slate. It's kind of up to you what you do with it. And I think that applies also to how you communicate between Xojo and FileMaker server. You've got a bunch of options, but you've got to make them happen. That's kind of why I've come to really like this Easy API that I keep talking about, because I can look at it, I can pretty easily get an API up and running pretty quickly and then adapt it if I need to. So.
Yeah, so if you want to see that in more depth, you can certainly tune into this webinar that's here, Use a FileMaker database with a Xojo iOS app, and goes through a couple examples of how you can specifically do that. All right, we got a question here from D-Gale. Is there something graphical like the relationship graph?
I'll answer that one. No, there isn't. I think the biggest parallel that you could draw between like using Xojo and working in the IDE and comparing it to FileMaker is when you're looking at the IDE and you're looking visually at the app, it's kind of like being in layout mode. How would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say it's, well, first, yeah, there is no relationship graph in the Xojo product. There are SQL tools, SQL tools that you can build, make lines between tables to help you create queries. But I think in Xojo, it's much more like execute SQL. And you just create your SQL statement that does what you want to do, and that ends up kind of being your relationship graph. That there are third-party tools, but I've actually found that I don't really need them anymore, because I know how all my tables are related to each other. And the big difference, I guess, the other difference is that, like in FileMaker, you're always dealing with a layout that's based on a table. But with Xojo, it's not connected. So you always ask for what you want. So you might do a simple query like in SQL, just like you could do in execute SQL in FileMaker. You might say select asterisk from contacts, and that would give you back all the fields for contacts and all the data. And then you would just use that data to show what you want to show on the screen. So you kind of really don't need the relationship graph anymore. So you could find a third-party tool that might help you with that.
All right, great. Follow-up question from D-Gale is, so do I have to pay $99 to find out what Xojo can do? I should have mentioned that on my pricing screen. No, you don't. Xojo is free to use. It essentially has an unlimited trial. You can download Xojo and you can create desktop apps using it and run them right from within Xojo. You can't distribute them or deploy them. And you can do the same thing for web and for iOS. You can create apps and run them from within Xojo in what we call debug mode, but they can't be deployed. So you can certainly do that to play around with Xojo and get a feel for it without having to pay anything. And then once you get to a point where you actually need to create apps or solutions for your customers or whatnot that you want to deploy somewhere, then you need to purchase a particular version of Xojo for what you're trying to build. Or you get Xojo Pro, which just lets you do everything. All right, John is asking.
So in like,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Hal.
Paul, one sec. On that last one, Paul, like some of the words you use aren't super familiar in the FileMaker community. Basically, what Paul was saying is you can run your anything you want to build in Xojo, you download the demo, which is the real product, and you can run it. And so that means it'll build it real quick and let you run it. But as soon as you quit, there's no app there. If you want to distribute it to someone else, you would need to compile it, which, and Paul said, build. So you compile it, and that gives you something like the runtime or your iOS app that you could distribute to other people. So Xojo is like amazing. I mean, they make this thing totally open. You could use it. If you don't feel comfortable, you can keep running it in demo mode. But once you're ready to go ahead and sell it or give it to a client, or you pay for what you need and then you build it and you're good to go.
All right. Thanks, Hal, for that clarification. That's why I brought you here, right? All right. Let's see. John has a question. Can you develop Android apps? And there's a related question right afterwards from Ralph asking on any news on native Android support. So first of all, Xojo cannot create native Android apps, but you can create what are called mobile web apps that are designed to run on an Android browser, and you can resize themselves and whatnot so they work on a smaller Android type device. So that is absolutely possible. Actually, the demo app that I had a link for earlier, demos.xojo.com, if you open that URL on like an iPhone or an Android phone, you'll see that it gets a completely different UI that's redesigned to fit better on the smaller devices. So that's how you can do mobile web type apps. But at this point, we do not have native Android support, and unfortunately, no, there's no news I can share on that. All right, let me just mark these as answered.
But Paul, I think to clarify that, you haven't ruled out that might happen at some point in the future, right? Is that a good way to put it?
That's right. My answer did not rule that out. It just said that I can't offer any news on that. So.
All right. Okay. Yep.
All right. Another question from D. Gale is: my data must be external? That's a question. FileMaker can use external and internal. I'm not exactly sure what that means. So.
No, the data doesn't have to be external. And Hal, you've got examples of where you're putting SQLite databases directly inside your apps. So there's that, and then we obviously have apps that are hitting external data sources as well. So so the answer is no, it does not have to be external.
Okay, great. Tim, your iOS apps hitting FileMaker, correct?
Right. We also have some now that are hitting Aurora. So yeah.
All right, Robert is asking, what resources would you recommend to learn Xojo? Learning Xojo as a FileMaker developer is like using a Mac after only using a PC. Interesting analogy. Well, I will just chime in and to say that certainly head over to the Dev Center, maybe head over to the video section. There's about 70-ish webinars that I've done over the past few years that are organized in various categories. It might be a great starting place. There's also a Getting Started page in the Dev Center that kind of groups all the introductory type material in one place for you to link to. So that might be one place to start. Guys, you got anything to add?
That page that you mentioned, Paul, the intro, I think there's a link to the Intro to Programming PDF. That page is amazing. There's so many resources that I sent that link to somebody else last week, and it has a lot of good stuff on it.
Yeah, my advice would be, I think the absolute best resource is the sample apps that come with Xojo. And there's, Paul, how many of them is it? 300 or something crazy?
Yeah, there's 350, including the full source for the demo app that's at demos.xojo.com.
Yeah, so that's a great way to learn right there. If you're one of those people who learns by sort of, getting under the hood and seeing how something works, then playing around with those sample apps is a great way to do it.
All right. John is asking, how stable is Xojo? More stable than, I don't know how you would measure that, I guess.
I think it's, I'm not sure whether he's asking about the company or not. I can't answer that. But, if you're trying to think about stability as far as the technology or the platform goes, it's going to be different than something like, running a hosted database on FileMaker server, because as far as Xojo goes, once you create the app or the web app, whatever it is, and you compile it, it's done. its stability, I think at that point is just going to depend on the operating system itself and how well the application was developed and written. So that's a tough one to answer, but I would say yes, it's stable.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've had some web apps that just run and run and run and run, and I don't even think about it, which I really, really like. So I'd say it's very stable, but that really depends upon your code and the computer it's running on. And so if your code's good, it should be a stable app.
All right, and I see there's a follow-up from John that's noting he was asking about the software. And I will note for people that haven't, maybe aren't too familiar with Xojo, the company, we have been around since 1998 and aren't intending to go anywhere anytime soon. So that's a little background on the company info there. All right, John is also asking a follow-up on how future-proof is the underlying technology that Xojo uses. The underlying technology has just recently transitioned. We released a couple months ago, a release of Xojo added the ability to do 64-bit, which essentially all your apps use modern 64-bit app sizes so they can take advantage of more memory and be a little bit faster than 32-bit apps. And we're using essentially the open source toolchain to do our compiling there, the LLVM toolchain. That's the same system that's used by Apple with Xcode for compiling things, and even Microsoft is now looking at that stuff. So that's kind of our low-level underlying technology that we're working with. And at this point, I can say I mean that's pretty future-proof at this point when you got two big name companies working with that. All right, let's move on here to a question by Ethan. Is anyone actually creating hybrid Xojo / FileMaker apps, particularly using Xojo on iOS to access or submit to the FileMaker server? A lot of DB building and dev that works so well in FileMaker would be aimed to do in something else. Tim, that sound like something you have been doing?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was describing earlier,
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that I turned to Xojo, because I have, I'm really interested in developing iOS apps, and that's what a lot of my clients have been asking for. And at the same time, they've got, fairly large investments in the FileMaker platform, not just on the hardware and software side, with the FileMaker software, but in all the time and energy that went into developing those FileMaker solutions. So that's the beauty of the hybrid model, is that you can continue to run your FileMaker solution just as it is today. And now all of a sudden you've got these native apps that are hitting that database. They're just doing it in a different way. It's, instead of the users coming in from something like FileMaker Pro or Go or WebDirect, they're coming in from these native apps or web apps developed with things like Xojo or really anything else. There's nothing to stop you from hitting your FileMaker databases with other technology. So,
right.
Tim,
Yeah,
can you say something? I'm sorry, Paul. Tim, can you talk about what we were discussing? Tim and I are working on a project together that hasn't been approved yet, but could you talk a little bit about using the FileMaker backend and then also with the Amazon product?
Yeah,
like how we were going to do a switch over?
Yeah, that's a great thing to chat about. Yeah, so right now we have an opportunity to help a prospect out who, again, has a pretty sizable investment in a FileMaker solution. His concern is that if he rolls out a mobile app, which is what his goal is, that FileMaker is not going to scale, when we start getting thousands of users hitting that thing. So, what the plan is to, again, have the Xojo app go through an API and then have the API talk to FileMaker in the short term. But in the long term, if we want to go to something that's more of an enterprise class database on the back end, like again, Aurora, we just retool the API and point it to Aurora. And in theory, anyway, everything should just work fine because the actual app itself has really no idea what's going on the back end. It's just making calls for data or, pushing up updates to records and so on and so forth. So it's a good way to kind of transition if you get to a point where what you're doing in FileMaker is no longer scaling the way you need it to. You can sort of make a sort of smooth transition away from that.
And even Apple, like when you're creating iOS apps, Apple highly suggests that you use an API rather than talking to the database directly to give you a buffer of security. Because if somebody's able to listen in on your traffic, they could figure out how to access your database. But by using the API, the only things that can be done, if somehow they reverse engineer your API, the only things they can do are the things that you allow your API to do. Like, so if your API only allows you to create records, there's no way that they could go through and delete records or edit records.
That's a good point, Hal. All right. And before I continue, we are going to get through all these questions. I want to remind everyone this webinar is being recorded and will be posted probably later tomorrow for you to download and review at your leisure. And let's move along here. So we've got a question here from Hootie. How easy is it to maintain Xojo apps? How does it cope with OS updates, for example? Well, in general, I mean, we keep Xojo up to date. It's updated quarterly, pretty much. We don't one release a quarter is what we strive for. I think we meet that pretty much every year. So we're able to stay on top of the rapid OS changes that are coming down the pike, particularly the ones from Apple. They're pumping out OS updates yearly at this point, but Microsoft seems to step up their game as well. But yeah, as far as that, generally, you don't have to do much with your app. I mean, if there's some problem, you may need to make sure you have a current version of Xojo, and then you rebuild your app using the more recent version of Xojo. But other than that, I don't think there's much you really need to worry about.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
Paul, I'm going to need to bail out. I'm actually doing the hour of code this week, and so I need to be at the school at 1 o'clock to give the next hour. So
that's right.
I want to thank everybody for joining, and sorry that I have to kind of bail out sooner than I hoped. I wasn't expecting so many questions, but they're all good questions, and I'm sure that you guys can handle them. So,
all right. Well, thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
And Paul's question, that was actually John's question because the question list kind of jumped.
Oh, yes, it did jump.
It wasn't Hootie's question.
All right, that was John's question. Well, anyway, that was John's question. So let's move on to what Hootie's question actually was. Let's see here. The best thing about FileMaker is the rapid development. How comparable is Xojo to FileMaker in that area? Well, I mean, certainly Xojo is not nearly as rapid as FileMaker. It's maybe like the Three Bears thing. I mean, Xojo is a heck of a lot easier than using something like Visual Studio or Xcode, but it is not nearly as easy as using something like FileMaker. So, you know, we like to say it's the just right solution, I suppose. But yeah, it's more work than FileMaker. So go ahead, Hal.
Yeah, so like from using both, FileMaker rocks in that you can just go add, like if we kind of do things scarily in FileMaker, and it's okay. Like I do it too. In fact, like it really seems like the proper way to do things would be to have a development server and a production server, and then you would do all your new changes in your development server, and if they work, you would move those changes to your production server. But I never do that. I just go in. In fact, I'm actually sitting in one of our clients right now, and I work live on the system. I open up their managed database, and I add tables, I add fields, and sometimes I lock everybody out for like 45 minutes. So we don't have that in Xojo. We have in Xojo, we're creating apps. So what we would do is we would have our app, and then we would deploy that app to everybody. So if it was a web app, we would take that web app, put it up on our server, run it, and then people would hit it with their web browsers. And then if we needed to, then like let's say we wanted to add a new field, we would go to our code and we would write code to add that field to our database using, and the way we would do it is we would create SQL statements to actually create the columns that we would need. And then we would go to our window and we would add the field to that window. And with easy data, that would pretty much be it if it was just a text field. And then we would compile it. And then at some point, we would swap out the web app. So we have a process to shut down the web app, bring in the new web app, bring it up, and then everyone would hit that new web app. So it's a little bit different, but I think it's not as convenient, but I think it's a better method of doing things. So it's just a matter of what's more important to you.
All right, I'm going to scroll my list here again. All right, I got an anonymous question here that scrolled off yet again. All right, let's see here. Does developing for Xojo mean you have to install a separate SQL server, whereas FileMaker has its own? And does it support something like drag and drop field names that are directly linked? Well, I think you can say, I mean, Xojo can use SQLite, which isn't really a server. It's more of a file-based database. So you don't need a separate server if you're working with that. Otherwise, if you need a server, you can connect to any type of server you want. Oracle, Postgres, MySQL, whatever. And then does Xojo support drag and drop field names that are directly linked? No, Xojo does not support that. I think Hal's talked a little bit. That's one of the libraries he's been working on, is essentially to add that kind of capability to Xojo.
Right. And just like Paul said, if you're building a web app for a small team of X number of people, you can literally use SQLite. And like Paul said, it's file-based, but it's crazy fast and crazy expandable. I didn't trust it, but now my mind's totally changed. It's freaking amazing. And that requires no database server because it's just a file, and that file is living right next to the app, which gives you some really cool power. We have true separation model. We have our app and we have our SQL file. And when we're ready to change something in our app, we replace the app and leave the SQL file alone. But you can use a server. Tim mentioned earlier, like Amazon's Aurora. You get an Aurora. It's a MySQL database. You could use that. GoDaddy and other web hosts have SQL servers that you can pay monthly fees for. You can run it on your own server, so you can do what you want. You can keep it local and just use something simple, or you can get something bigger that can help you expand.
All right, Michael is asking, can Xojo access and use SQL and NoSQL databases? Well, Xojo, as I mentioned, has built-in capability for just about any SQL type database. I rattle off the list. See MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, ODBC for everything else. That probably sounds like all of them. There is no built-in support in Xojo for NoSQL databases, but there are at least 2 open source projects on GitHub for accessing NoSQL databases. Mongo might be one of them, if I recall the name properly. And you can find, if you go to the Dev Center and you search there for open source, you can find that on the list. So you can grab that if you need to play around with one of those type of databases. All right, John is asking, what, if anything, do you miss most about FileMaker? FileMaker makes some things pretty easy. Is Xojo a lateral move? Where is Xojo most challenging relative to FileMaker? That's all you, Hal.
Yeah. So I think this is kind of like a yin and yang kind of thing. I miss having my layouts bound to a FileMaker record, let's say table record. But I also like not having that. I've always had a challenge in the past with like FileMaker security, where you might have 10,000 customers, but your salespeople are only supposed to access who they're allowed to, like whoever they're assigned to. So in FileMaker, they go to their customers and they just do show all records. And then, so you have to do work to not let them see certain things. Or you could use FileMaker's privileges to say you have no access to that record. And then when they go to that record they don't have access to, it says no access. So I always thought that was a little odd. So with Xojo, so I like how FileMaker does things because it's really crazy easy, but I don't like it because the security is off to me. In Xojo, the same example, I would basically make a similar call that I would with execute SQL. I would say select star from customers where sales ID equals Hal. And that would just pull me those people's records, and then I would display those on the layout. So the security is like much easier because there's no way they can access other things, which is really good. A couple other things I miss, drop down dates, like for a date field. That I was really surprised. We went to go put a field on our layout for a date, and it just wasn't there. But the cool part is I was able to write one, and I posted a thing on the forums trying to look. At first, I searched the forums, try to find if somebody already created one. I couldn't find one. Nobody, and I asked if there was one. Nobody came up with one what I was looking for. So I just wrote one. Xojo actually has you have the ability within Xojo to subclass objects. So Xojo has a text field. So what I did is I subclassed it, which means I made my own version of the text field, and I get everything that the text field already does for free. And then I can add functionality to it. So I wrote my own, and after I wrote it, I posted it up on the forums so other people could use it. So the short answer is I miss a lot of the things that are quote unquote free, but I can build those in Xojo. That cost me time, but when I release my apps with Xojo, I don't have to pay to FileMaker for FileMaker Pro for every one of my users, but I have to pay for that in time to get something built. So I think that's how I feel about that.
All right. Thanks, Hal. Let's see here. So David is asking, can we please email or post a copy of the slides? Along with the recording of this webinar, a PDF of the slides will also be available. That'll be in the Dev Center. I'll try to get that included in the follow-up email that's sent out automatically on webinars. But if you go to our Dev Center here, you can see there's kind of some main areas here. And if you expanded resources and videos and clicked on webinars, you would get a list here. And then once the recording's available, I'll have the one for today, December 8th, with a link here. And it'll have downloads for everything, including the slides. Ralph asked,
Paul, I'll send you a list of those products that I talked about earlier, so you can add that to it.
Yeah, I can put more links on the page with the video as well. Hutrain was asking for the demo link again for Xojo, so you can see I just opened that up here in Safari. So you can see it's demos.xojo.com for the demo app. And this app is also included with Xojo as well in the examples folder. If you click on examples and then go to sample applications, this is called Eddie's Electronics, and it's in that folder there. All right. David is asking, is there any syncing for mobile? Do you need to build it? Are there any resources? I guess it's referring, I don't know what the syncing would mean. Syncing between the database and the mobile app?
That's exactly what he means.
Okay. Well, I don't know that. I mean, that would be how you'd implement it. I mean, normally your mobile app would probably use the API to talk directly to the data source. So syncing wouldn't really be necessary. Is there something else?
So I think what he's looking for, Paul, FileMaker has the ability to create FileMaker Go apps on iOS, and it can store data locally, or you can connect to the server. And as far as I know, there's nothing that exists right now to let you synchronize between it. You'd have to write it.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the one thing that Tim is doing in his app that he just released today, the ICD-10 research app, I believe that what he's doing is he's hitting the API. So he's literally from his iOS app that's on the App Store right now. He's making calls to his FileMaker server, and then that brings down the data. And once he has the data, he caches it locally if you bookmark certain ICD-10 codes, so that those things that you bookmark are stored in the app. So that's kind of syncing. His app doesn't push back up to the server, but that's something he could write. So the answer is yes, you need to build what you want to synchronize. That's very similar to FileMaker too, though.
Yep, you'd sounds like you would need to build that. I don't know that we have any specific resources on that topic to speak of. That's kind of a more general thing um, at this point. All right, got an anonymous question here. What type of UI styling controls do you have? All the apps I've seen look very Windows XP-ish. Well, hopefully the apps that are running on a Mac don't look Windows XP-ish. Xojo itself primarily is using the OS native controls for the various target platforms. So in the case of Windows, it's using Win32 native controls. Those I wouldn't say look Windows XP-ish because the style does change depending on the operating system. For example, buttons look a little bit different in Windows 10 than they did in, I guess, Windows Vista or maybe even Windows 8. But that sort of styling is all kind of coming from the operating system because these are all native controls. There's not a lot of built-in control to do styled stuff. I mean, you can, like Hal has mentioned, you can subclass the controls and kind of tweak things that way and then use your subclass controls if you need different look and feel, so to speak.
There's someone in the community that has created like their own styles, and in fact, we actually use styles. The demo app that Paul has up right now, anything that has a special look, you create. It's literally called a style in Xojo, and you assign that style to that item. And at any point in your code, you can change that style. And
Right,
I believe, and Paul will have to correct me or not, if you look at this demo app, demos.xojo.com, if you look at it on a Mac, it'll look different on Windows, and it might look even different on Linux.
Well, that's mixing up a couple things. I was referring mostly to desktop type stuff. Yeah, the web stuff that Hal's mentioning do have styles built in, so you can style the controls, kind of using stuff that's very similar to CSS. So that is neat. And yeah, what you'll see for web apps can look a little bit different depending on how the browser renders things. You know, like buttons might render differently in Safari versus Chrome or something like that. But again, we try to use the native things that are built in, so you might get slightly different things like that. All right, another sync question here from John. How easy is it to sync data? Can you capture data on a local DB and then sync it to a DB in the cloud when internet connection becomes available? Well, yeah, you absolutely can do that, but I wouldn't say that's easy in that Xojo doesn't have any built-in syncing capabilities, as we talked about. So you'd have to essentially implement that yourself. You would probably have a local SQLite database that you're saving things to that maybe periodically connects to a server and then looks for records that have changed and pushes them up to the server. But you would have to do that yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Just like the app Tim has, as I described that, you could do it in that method.
All right, Ward is asking, can you talk about cybersecurity with Xojo web apps? How do we test? Well, security in web apps could be, I think, a week-long series of webinars. I can point you to, if I find the page here.
While Paul's looking at that, Xojo, that's been like a huge topic for Xojo. They actually, I think it was 2 XDCs ago, the developer conference, they had a security professional come in and talk to us about all the kick butt things they've been doing on the web apps. And I don't remember all of them, but it was crazy impressive. And Xojo also offers the Xojo Cloud, which runs on crazy secure servers. In fact, they've actually added a lot of web-only features for security for your web apps. So by default, and I don't know all of this, so Paul will have to correct me, but by default, when you put your database up there, there's not too many ports open. So if you want to go off and do something, you have to write code to open up the port, do what you need to do, and either the port will close itself after you move away, or you have to tell it to close. So.
Right, yeah, and as Hal said, I mean, here at Xojo, we do offer something called Xojo Cloud, which is hosting for web apps, and it has some database servers built in. And we do pride ourselves in that being incredibly secure. This page I brought up here from the Dev Center also highlights some of the security things that Xojo has focused, or just based on the Open Web Application Security Project, how Xojo applies to these things. And we have had third-party people come in and test Xojo web apps for security. And probably one of the big things that's different for Xojo web apps is just that they're compiled apps that run on a server, which is kind of a little bit of built-in security just by having that, as opposed to essentially scripts that are running on the server. All right.
I would highly recommend I'd highly recommend everybody reading that, just that first item that you can see at the bottom, like just using prepared statements. That just protects you from SQL injection. And while Xojo has Xojo Cloud, you don't have to host it with Xojo, but if security is an issue, I'd recommend that. But you can also build your web apps and run it on your own machines, co-located machines. It's very, very flexible.
Right. All right. James is asking webinar again. Yes, the recording is going to be posted. I think I mentioned that earlier, so we'll close that question. Let's see. Another question from James. How does Xojo integrate into a multi-user environment? Does the IDE support Git requests? Well, Xojo works just fine with multiple developers and with source control systems such as Git. But you will need to have a purchase license in order to use the file format that saves everything as separate text files so that it works better with something like Git or Subversion or whatever you choose to use. But other than that, Xojo is, fully enabled for multi-developer work. I mean, the same people can have the same project open at the same time and working on it. With source control systems, you just, pull down the local copy you're working on, make your changes, and then you push up the changes into the repository, and then they're merged in. We have a few webinars we've done on Git and Subversion that people can watch if they need a bit more specifics on that. There is no built-in capabilities in the Xojo IDE for working with source control systems, so you either choose to use the command line, or I prefer to use GUI apps myself, but they all work just fine. Is there a way to call a Xojo app from FileMaker? A question from Richard. I don't know.
I'm not quite sure in what context, but I'll make up the context. So if you have your FileMaker system running, you could create a Xojo web app, and Xojo web app has inside the application, there's a thing called, and I probably get this wrong, is it handle special URL, Paul?
That's right, yeah.
So handle special URL allows you to intercept the request, get the bits of the URL that the user passed, do something with that, and then return the data back to FileMaker. So that would be one way you could have, can you call a Xojo app? Yeah. So from FileMaker, you could do insert from URL, have it call your web app, and then have it come back. You can also, if you were doing desktop, from your FileMaker app, you could tell it to open your Xojo local app, but I'm not sure how else. I guess I need more about the question to say anything more.
Right, yeah, that kind of depends more on FileMaker really than anything else. But Xojo is certainly open enough that you could, launch it if it's an app you've built separately or connect to data that it's providing to you. All right, I've got an anonymous question here. What about Xojo's UI design capabilities? How much control is there? Well, Xojo has a bunch of built-in controls, as have been talked about, and you can certainly grab the trial version and play around and see what it comes with. There's a bunch for desktop, web, and iOS. It varies a bit depending on which one you're working with. All of three of those also include what is called the canvas control that essentially allows you to build your own controls. You just draw what you want on the screen, and you can essentially create custom controls with that. You can also create custom controls by subclassing any of the controls Xojo comes with and adding capabilities like Hal did for his date field that he wanted. And you can also use the container control that Hal mentioned earlier to essentially combine multiple controls together to make kind of a new combo UI control that you can reuse in your app. So I think there's a fair amount of power there.
I think of it as a I think of containers as a subform, which are totally different than FileMaker containers.
All right. David again is asking about a syncing question here. If you created an iOS app, are there resources for syncing? No, unfortunately not. You'd have to implement that yourself. All right. Anonymous question. How are web apps uploaded using FTP? Well, I certainly wouldn't use FTP. That's highly insecure, but SFTP, the secure version, works. Web apps are built as actual apps, so you just have to get them up to your server if you're using your own server. Usually SFTP is the preferred way to do that. If you're using Xojo Cloud, as
If you use
earlier, you can just press the deploy button in Xojo itself, and it'll build it and copy the app up to the Xojo Cloud for you automatically.
sometimes I use Dropbox, but that's pretty much the same as FTP, sort of.
Yeah, that could work. You'd need a little bit more control of your server, and your server probably would need maybe UI capabilities. But yeah, whatever works for transferring files is going to work.
Absolutely.
I got an anonymous question here. Back to UI design. Can you give things a modern flat look? The demo app UI looks dated. Well, the demo app that I showed here is a web app. Certainly, if you wanted to add styles to that, you could change the look and feel for however you wanted to make it look. Right now, there aren't really any styles on any of the stuff, so it's just using the built-in browser controls kind of as they are. But you could certainly, using styles, make it look however that you want. As
specifically on iOS tends to look flat. I haven't seen too many Mac apps look flat, but yeah, you can definitely style it how you wish.
Right. All right, let's mark that one here. Oh, and this question looks like it was for Tim, but unfortunately he left us. So Hal, we can make up answers to this question. Let's see here. Any more thoughts on his FM?
I might know an answer for that.
Veto. If you know an answer, ask it. Otherwise, well, I'll suggest you email Tim.
Yeah, I would say pop Tim a question on the FM peeps or email or whatever. He doesn't have FM EZP API for Xojo yet, but if you wanted to build something similar to that, that's where you could build a web app and use the handle special URL feature. With that, you can send web requests to Xojo and have it come back with data that you're interested in. And that works with GET and POST and probably other stuff that I don't know about.
All right. Tony's also asking about multiple developers working on Xojo at the same time. And as I said, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, just in case people aren't aware, the Xojo IDE itself is actually made using Xojo. And we have a team of developers that are all working on it at the same time. We use Subversion for our source control system. But I myself have worked on plenty of projects using Git as well. And there's a large number of open source Xojo projects on GitHub that have multiple people contributing. So yeah, Xojo has no trouble at all working with multiple developers.
The Xojo IDE is very good. There's little tiny issues here and there, but all in all, it's very good. Sometimes you have to be a little patient. I've done some finding, replacing across the entire project, and some controls have appeared to have not renamed, but they actually have. But I usually save my project. If anything feels wonky, I just hit save, close the project, open it, and it's all good. But I've never, ever, ever had any data loss whatsoever.
Yeah, and obviously we haven't really shown Xojo here, so we're telling you how great it is. We're not showing it to you because we're sneaky like that. But this webinar has already gone pretty long. We won't have time for that. But I did just recently, within the last week or two, did a webinar called Rapid Application Development, which you will find right here. Rapid Application Development. Actually, that one wasn't recorded, but the one from September was. And if you want to watch a webinar where you kind of get an overview of the Xojo IDE itself and how to throw together a simple app and stuff like that, click on that one, give that one a watch, and that hopefully will help you out. All right, and so I'm clearing questions here. All right, this is a follow-up from Richard, and he was asked about the app from FileMaker question, and specifically he has a Xojo console app that talks to a connected device, and he wants to call that app, run it, have it do its task, and return the data to FileMaker. Is that possible? Well, I mean, to me, it sounds like it would be possible as long as FileMaker can call an app and receive data from the app. You certainly can create a Xojo console app to do what it wants and to return the data how it wants, I suppose. So, I mean, technically, this sounds possible to me. Thoughts, Hal?
I haven't really done too much with console apps, but I know that you can run them from the command line. So with Xojo or with FileMaker, I know you could call an Apple script that calls something from the command line and then pass that data back. So I would say that would be possible. And then I guess you could also in your console app, and I'm getting the terms wrong here. What's the HTTP classes, Paul? What are they called?
They're sockets.
So that you could build like a web interface? Sockets. Yeah, you could also use Xojo's sockets to create a communication method.
Yeah, this is more of a FileMaker side question because I don't really know what FileMaker has for communication type capabilities. But Xojo, I mean, lots of people within Xojo itself will do this sort of design. We'll create a Xojo console app that does something, and then have like a Xojo GUI app talk to the console app. Maybe the console app is doing this exact thing, talking to a device, or maybe they're spinning up multiple console apps to crunch data or something like that. All right, that was our last question. Let's see here. This I think we've got the honor of this being the longest webinar we've ever done. So congratulations, FileMaker people, with all your wonderful questions. All right, I will remind everyone.
Yeah, thank you everybody very much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I will remind everyone that this is recorded and this recording will be available. Like I said, expect this, what's today? Today's Tuesday, so expect this later Wednesday. And it'll be right here on the Dev Center on this webinar page is where you can find the initial link, and that is the URL right up there. And you can head on over to Xojo.com and download Xojo to play around with it in the meantime. I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Hal, for helping me answer these questions. Thank you, Tim, who has left us, but also helped. And have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.